The quad at Emory University is this big green space hugged by imposing stone buildings. It's this central gathering spot, humming with the sound of students hustling to class or relaxing on the grassy lawn.
But on a sunny morning last week and on many days since then, chants like this one have carried across the quad.
What do we want? Ceasefire! When do we want it? Now!
Protests against the war in Gaza are rocking college campuses in Georgia and across the nation.
Here in Atlanta, demonstrations continue at Emory, where last week law enforcement used pepper balls, zip ties, and brute force to dismantle an encampment of protesters.
I think the fact that it was so violent so quickly caught everyone off guard.
And while many Democrats and civil rights groups criticize the crackdown, Governor Brian Kemp and other top Republicans say law enforcement will not hesitate to step in again.
You know, if you've broken the law, if you're damaging property, if you're assaulting, especially police officers, you should have harsh penalties to send a message. We are not going to allow Georgia to become the next Columbia University.
President Joe Biden addressed the campus protests from the White House.
Dissent is essential to democracy, but dissent must never lead to disorder or to denying the rights of others so students can finish the semester and their college education.
The clashes are dominating headlines as Biden prepares to address graduates later this month at Morehouse College.
The choice has drawn interest and backlash due to Biden's stance on the conflict.
I hope the ceremony goes smoothly. I don't mind protesting as long as, my family gets to enjoy both my achievements and the achievements of my peers.
In this episode, we'll take you onto the campuses of Emory University and Morehouse College. I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast.
We're going to bring in criminal justice reporter Chamian Cruz, who arrived on the Emory campus not long after law enforcement began removing protesters last Thursday. Chamian, can you describe the scene when you first arrived on campus?
Well, Sam, as soon as I got there, I saw hundreds of people and some police officers standing around the quad, watching a main group of demonstrators who were chanting things like, "We demand a ceasefire" and "Free Palestine." This was around noon, so by that point, the quad had been taped off with yellow tape, and the mood was really tense on campus.
Chamian, can you describe the demonstration itself? Initially, we were hearing conflicting narratives about the tone of the protest. Who was protesting? Were they impeding the operation of the university? What did you see?
Yeah, there was a lot of back and forth about what happened, especially at the beginning. A spokesperson for the university initially said the protesters were trespassers seeking to disrupt classes. But later on, she told me that some students had joined in the demonstration and clashed with Atlanta police and Georgia State troopers. And that's because they were allegedly throwing bottles at officers and refusing to leave. But one student protester I spoke with on the campus said the encampment was by all means a peaceful demonstration with protesters just sitting around, sharing coffee, reading books. I think at some point they were tie-dyeing T-shirts. And now we know that out of the more than 24 people who were arrested, almost all were students and faculty.
So, Chamian, can you describe the ways in which law enforcement used force to then break up this encampment?
So during the initial demonstration, our photographer at WABE, Matthew Pearson, he said he saw officers with the Emory Police Department, Atlanta Police Department, and Georgia State Patrol use pepper balls to disperse the crowd. And videos from different media stations that were there also show that several protesters were tackled to the ground, tased, and taken away in zip ties. And there's a video from CNN that's been widely shared on social media that shows a tenured professor witnessing the arrest of a student and asking one of the officers, "What are you doing?" She was then pushed to the ground and arrested. And when I went back to campus that night, I saw officers again use pepper balls to break up the crowd and get ready to make more arrests, though I don't think there were any more that night.
So, Chamian, does the school, the state patrol, the APD, the state, do they stand behind their actions last Thursday?
So Emory University President Greg Fenves issued a statement this week apologizing for mischaracterizing the protesters as trespassers. And he says he's devastated with how law enforcement treated them, but he also says he supports students who, quote, wish to express their views peacefully and free from disruptions. So APD and Georgia State Patrol have also admitted to using non-lethal force, but they say, again, it's because some of these demonstrators were throwing bottles at them and refusing to leave after they were told to get off campus. And the students we've heard from so far dispute that claim, saying that the demonstration was peaceful.
Now, I don't always want to make it about us in this context being reporters, but I do want to ask you, were you able to get the access you needed to document what was happening?
Yeah, Rahul, I was able to get what I needed, but I did have a little trouble toward the end when I had to decide whether to leave the protest or stay and risk being tear gassed or possibly arrested. Those were the two options that one of the officers gave me after I told him I was a reporter and wanted to observe what was happening from a distance and not join the group protesting at the quad.
It don't matter. Either you go over there with them or you leave. You cannot stand behind us. You have one choice. Go over there or leave.
In the end, I chose to stay, but I hope I'm never faced with that dilemma again because I'm a reporter and I need to be able to do my job.
So one thing I do want to mention, I sit on the boards of the Atlanta Press Club and the Georgia chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and I know we've been having these discussions about how to make the complicated relationship between law enforcement and press work, and that includes training for law enforcement officers on how to work with reporters in the field. With all of that said, I really do appreciate all of your work last week.
Thanks, Rahul.
Chamian, I want to broaden this out a little bit. You've covered a lot of the protests in Atlanta, including the ongoing demonstrations against the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, also known as Cop City, that sometimes have been met with a strong show of force from law enforcement. Can you talk about how and when we've seen law enforcement act swiftly to quell protest, how those decisions are made, and whether you were surprised at all by the response we saw from law enforcement on the campus of Emory University?
Well, Sam, I wasn't surprised by what happened at Emory because of what we've seen at some of these other protests against the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. As you might remember, there was an environmental activist who was camping at the site last year who was shot and killed by state troopers. And so protests have only intensified after that, as well as the police response anytime there's a protest. And so I think all of this just goes back to the tough on crime mentality and policies that exist here in the South and specifically in Georgia.
And I think we've seen that echoed in the response from Republicans like Attorney General Chris Carr and Governor Brian Kemp. In a statement, Kemp applauded law enforcement for responding swiftly to, quote, restore order, saying anyone who intimidates or promotes violence will be, quote, met with the full force of the law. And of course, we also heard that tape this week from Kemp at the top of the show. Recently, Kemp also told a Republican audience that he told Georgia's public safety commissioner that if protesters block bridges or roads to, quote, lock their ass up. Now, you do have some Democrats like the chamber's only Jewish representative, Esther Panich, who has criticized the protests, saying some of them have these anti-Semitic undertones. But many other Democrats have condemned this police response. The legislature's only Palestinian-American representative, Rua Roman, spearheaded a letter from more than a dozen lawmakers that read in part, quote, the use of extreme anti-riot tactics by Georgia State Patrol is a dangerous escalation to protests, which were by all accounts peaceful and nonviolent. There is no justification for this kind of excessive force, end quote.
We've been speaking with WABE criminal justice reporter Chamian Cruz. Chamian, again, thank you for all of your reporting.
Thank you.
When we come back, WABE education reporter Juma Sei joins the pod. This is Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast.
Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
All right, so we just heard about the initial response to protesters on the campus of Emory University last week. Now we're going to explore what's happened since then and where these protests go next. WABE education reporter Juma Sei has been tracking demonstrations at Emory and other campuses in Georgia this week. Hey, Juma.
What's good, y'all? It's good to be on the pod.
So, Juma, let's stay on the Emory campus for a little bit longer. Protests are ongoing. What does that look like this week?
Yeah, so there have been a number of sort of continued protests and demonstrations this week. Overall, though, I should say that the sort of tenor of the vibe on campus is a lot more chill than what was happening last week, where you had sort of law enforcement's presence on campus. But I started this week on Monday at a student and faculty walkout that was held on campus. So students sort of walked out of class, faculty walked out of office hours and so on, and they sort of read a list of demands in response to the actions from last Thursday and just sort of in general sort of framing where Emory is in this. I should also say that there was a new encampment that popped up Wednesday on Emory's campus. My understanding is that encampment, it had initially sort of come up at the school's admissions building and bookstore, and then it was sort of moved over to the quad and sort of subsequently dismantled. On top of that, there was an Israeli solidarity demonstration Wednesday around 6:30 on campus, so I was there for that as well. So yes, sort of continued action, but overall, nothing sort of nothing of that kind of level of drama as last week.
So one thing that makes university protests different from, say, other ceasefire pro-Palestine protests that we've seen around the country are these demands for divestment. I was a campus administration reporter at my college paper, the Michigan Daily at the University of Michigan, and I covered divestment protests related to Israel, but also other topics like the fossil fuel industry. Juma, can you explain more what divestment is?
Yeah, so to just start with a definition here, when we're talking about divestment, we're talking about protesters' desire for universities to sell off their investments in companies that have businesses or other investments in Israel. And I should say that as you sort of alluded to, Sam, that there is a long history of divestment that tracks back to the 70s and the 80s even. Students at Columbia and other universities sort of back in the day were pressing their university administration to divest from companies that had involvements in South African apartheid way back when. I think another question to consider is how effective divestment actually is. And I think on one hand, sort of a single university or a number of universities pulling their sort of sponsorship doesn't necessarily change corporate behavior. At the same time, there are a lot of folks that say that like there is a strong moral message that's sent when a university sort of divests from, XYZ company. And that is something that sort of pro-Palestinian folks in the sort of modern day emphasize over and again.
So, Juma, can you introduce us to some of the folks on campus you've been talking to? Tell us about some of the fallout from the initial crackdown.
Yeah, so to just start with big picture framing of fallout, I spoke with a student off record, and the way that she described the air on campus right now is it's dystopian. She said that seniors are getting ready for graduation, folks are finishing finals. No one is okay, but everybody's saying they're okay. It's like that's the kind of the vibe that we're talking about. One of the students who I spoke to earlier this week is Janaki Radhakrishnan, who was part of the sort of organizing efforts last week. She was actually a student who had been arrested at last week's encampment. And I should flag for listeners that she's the person that we heard from at the very, very top of this segment. And I met her just after the walkout this week, and she was kind of just reflecting on what it was like to be back on campus, given the high sort of intensity police presence from last week. And this is what she had to say.
Seeing the response to students, particularly those fighting for Palestine right now, and looking at the history of police response in Atlanta to the Cop City movement, and just in the South in general, because the South has a really long history of students coming face to face with cops. I think that informed us that we could expect a high level of violence. But I also think we all kind of thought that the university would be smarter than that, quite frankly. I think the fact that it was so violent so quickly caught everyone off guard. I guess from my perspective, at the very least, I thought Emory wouldn't want the bad press.
Another thing that I should say, when I met Janaki, she was leading a group of pro-Palestinian demonstrators in song. This was after the university walkout earlier this week. And one of the things she emphasized, both sort of to the entire group and in our one-on-one conversation, is that she and other organizers were just trying to sort of foster an environment of healing and hope, largely through song and other sort of modes of kinship. I also talked to another student kind of on the other side of things, Rachel Friedman. I met her at the sort of Israel solidarity demonstration that had gone on Wednesday on campus. And one of the things that she emphasized is the ways that discussion had been stifled by kind of all of what's been going on campus. And this is something she had mentioned sort of even before the actions of last Thursday. Here's what she said about the sort of air on campus in general.
There's zero dialogue. There's zero willingness. It's become a very tribal thing where people rightfully or wrongfully feel like one group is against their group, and there's no room for dialogue because it's against you and not your ideas.
Something else that Rachel told me and a number of other Jewish students I spoke to both on and off the record said is that some of the protest chants from the pro-Palestinian sort of camp of folks, they felt like was anti-Semitic and sort of contributed to this idea of a campus climate culture that felt unsafe for them. I also just want to underscore that Rachel really sort of emphasizes that discussion was difficult to have before. It's been even more so now since the encampment clearing, because that sort of tribalism that she talks about has only heightened. People are sort of only more sort of enmeshed in their camps, which is sort of making dialogue difficult.
Okay, Juma, so that's students, but I want to also ask you about faculty and how they're responding. You know, I wonder, faculty are often some of the most outspoken critics of a university administration, and I'm wondering if at Emory, faculty are pushing back on the administration's response here as well.
Oh, yeah, there's been a whole lot of pushback on the sort of administration's response. I spoke with Noelle McAfee. She's the professor that Chamian had mentioned at the very sort of start of this podcast, the one who'd been arrested last week while observing what had been going on. And one of the things she's emphasized is that tribalism is normal in these moments, and she wants to encourage conversation and dialogue. That's something that she has personal experience with. Sort of given a little bit of the history of divestment. I had referenced that in the 70s and the 80s, there were sort of protests around apartheid in South Africa. Dr. McAfee says that she was part of that generation of folks, and something she wants to sort of bring from her personal history is just dialogue, dialogue, dialogue.
Not all Jewish students take this view, but some might feel like this is an assault on them, that it's personal. That's just normal. I mean, in politics, there's so many values and histories and contexts and misunderstanding, which is all the more reason we need to have spaces for dialogue across and bringing multiple perspectives and misunderstandings and work through them.
Another thing that Professor McAfee had said is that in calling law enforcement on students, sort of Emory University President Fenves issued a response or sort of, reacted in a way that was antithetical to that mission of dialogue. And because of that, McAfee and other faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences at Emory are actually holding a vote of no confidence this week in President Fenves. This is, I should say, like a largely symbolic vote. What will happen is there's a ballot that'll go out to all the faculty. They'll make a decision on whether or not they have confidence in the university president to sort of continue his duties. And then the results of that vote will be shared with the Emory Board of Trustees. And the Board of Trustees will ultimately make the final call on whether or not the president actually loses his job. But again, I think just to take a step back here, like, the president could, in theory, lose his job because of the way that he responded to last week's protests. Like, that is the kind of stakes of what we're talking about here when we're thinking about the frustration from faculty about last week.
Juma, you mentioned a deep history of law enforcement response to protests, specifically in the South. I mean, we're talking about student protests here, but I think we can all envision images of police cracking down on civil rights protesters in the 60s here in Georgia and in other states. And a thread that often comes up in these protests is this idea that these are not our people, not our citizens, not our community, but agitators from the outside. Talk to me about how that phrase has been used in this context and whether there's any truth to it.
Yeah, so the rhetoric of outside agitators has come up again and again in my reporting at Emory. The first thing I'll flag is President Fenvez's apology. The reason that he apologized to the community is because the university's claim that protesters, or the protesters last week, were not members of, or not sort of Emory students, and that was not the case. Something else that I should say is that pro-Palestinian protesters have openly embraced sort of inviting folks from around the city to demonstrate alongside them, and I think that also complicates the question of outside agitators, because in instances of vandalism like graffiti, then there's a question of, okay, who's actually accountable for this? At Emory, someone had sort of spray painted "Death to Israel" somewhere on campus. So organizers are kind of responding to that. And I should just lastly say that Emory, or demonstrations at Emory and demonstrations at schools across the country, are also seeing more and more counter protesters. And I think that's yet another example of the ways that sort of outside agitators and trying to figure out sort of who in the student population is protesting this versus who in the non-student population is protesting this has sort of come up, again, both here in Georgia and then across the country.
So, Juma, President Biden is going to be at Morehouse to give the commencement next month, which has generated debate due to his stance on the conflict in Gaza. You spent some time on the campus this week. What were you hearing there?
Yeah, so this is, I think, one of those moments where I think it's helpful for me to just take a step back and say that I did not talk to every single student at Morehouse by any means. I should say, though, that everyone that I talked to was not necessarily excited about Biden coming to campus. Now, there's a range of opinions here that I'll get into later, but just to sort of address some other points, there was an alumni letter that had been put together, sort of called on the university president to retract the invitation for Biden to speak at commencement because of the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. And in response to that, both the university provost and president have stood firm. They've said that, they are not going to uninvite the president to commencement. And they've also sort of made a point of communicating that the invitation that was sent to President Biden was sent before the October 7th attack. So just to clarify that. Now, looking at the range of student responses, opinions, all that kind of stuff to Biden coming to campus, I should just say from the start that there are a camp of folks who communicate that they think it's offensive for Biden to come, very much in tune with the letter from Morehouse alumni. They say that it's offensive to have Biden on campus, given all that has been playing out in the Middle East. So there's those camp of students that, again, kind of fall in line with this alumni letter that I had mentioned. But there are also those who are not as sort of politically involved, politically engaged, who see their graduation as a really beautiful terminus of 4 years of hard work. And because of that, want to be able to sort of celebrate the moment without thoughts of politics, quite frankly. This is Whistler Charles. I should say that he is one of the students who you heard from at the very top of this segment. And this is what he told me right in front of Graves, one of the buildings on Morehouse's campus.
I know it's a publicity stunt, but I'm more so worried about, are my family going to enjoy themselves? That's all. Because I know that there's, thoughts of protest and whatnot. So I hope the ceremony goes smoothly. I don't mind protesting as long as, my family gets to enjoy both my achievements and the achievements of my peers.
I should also say that there are those that kind of fall in the middle, folks that are sort of frustrated by Biden being on campus, but not to the end of seeing his presence as offensive. Quite frankly, they just kind of think it's a distraction. I spoke with Jordan Washington. He's another senior at Morehouse. And this is what he'd said just sort of about the way that he was thinking about this graduation and the way that he felt like the president coming was distracting from what was really important to him.
I say I'm kind of upset about it because obviously like we're the COVID class of high school. So a lot of people didn't get graduations, like actual high school graduation. And now it feels like our college graduation I feel like it's not more so, like people are focusing more on the speaker and like what's going to happen with him, what is he going to talk about, how are people going to respond to that, rather than focus on like what really matters, which is us, the graduates. I mean, Biden didn't do 4 years here, we did.
The last thing that I will say is that every student that I spoke to said that, opinions about Biden aside, they would just rather have a Black speaker come to address them, someone who feels more integrally tied to the sort of Morehouse community, and Morehouse mystique was the phrase I heard from folks. Another thing that students had said is they want someone that they could actually relate to, and no one that I spoke with felt like the president was that figure.
And I should just point out that Biden gets a lot of commencement requests. He has accepted 2 of them. So I think it's no coincidence that he's choosing to address a historically Black college in a swing state. Young voters of color will be key to Biden's efforts to defend Georgia after winning it in 2020. And any turnout dip could be disastrous for Biden. Just this week, Vice President Kamala Harris kicked off a tour here in Atlanta focused on economic opportunity, specifically talking about efforts to close the racial wealth gap and bolster Black businesses. But, many younger voters of color have soured on Biden in part because of the war in Gaza. So the stakes of this Morehouse speech could be really high.
Yeah, I think they will be really high. I also think that kind of a bedrock of all of the folks that I've talked to is they're just interested to see how things actually play out on campus. I'm going to be there either way, whether I'm reporting or whether I'm just sort of there to sort of take it all in. So I'm one of the folks that's interested to see the way that the president approaches this.
That's WABE education reporter Juma Sei. Juma, thank you for all of your amazing reporting.
Of course.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
You can get more Georgia politics online at wabe.org/election2024. We'll be back next Friday.